Hi, everyone. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Welcome back, or back, so to speak, since you're watching this from afar. Um, Before you engage in the two other activities for this week's online class, I just wanted to go over some key concepts and terms with you. Um, you'll see on the slide here that some of these terms are highlighted or in bold red, and that's because those are ones that are we're really going to be engaging in with Patricia's students during final exam day this semester and then in the spring semester in 209. So let me go over these concepts. I'll try to be pretty brief. You may already be familiar with some of these concepts, and indeed you should definitely be familiar with some, such as affective assessments, because that was your reading for today. And also global and local. Some of these other ones were brought up in the reading that you did just prior to Thanksgiving in this book, Accessible Assessment. All right, so you may already know the terms formative and summative assessments, but for those of you for whom those terms are new, um, these really refer to two different ki kinds of assessments or ways of using assessments, I guess. So formative assessments are designed to help you form or formulate instructional goals for your students and further instructional engagements. So, a formative assessment is going to be something that helps you learn about what your students' strengths and needs are so that you know where to go next with your students. They tend to not contribute, well, they tend to not stay with students forever. So a standardized assessment, your ISAT scores, your ACTs, end of unit tests, those kinds of things stay with you in the sense that they go into the grade book and they're recorded and they will contribute to a letter grade or some other sort of report card evaluation. Those are summative assessments. Formative assessments, again, don't stay with you in that way. Really, their primary purpose is to help you as a teacher think about what you need to do next to support the student. So that's really the primary difference. There is some gray area between them. Sometimes there are assessments that such as assessing a student's oral reading, which we'll do a lot of next semester. And those are sometimes used in summative ways in the sense that they may contribute to a decision as to whether a student is below grade level, at grade level, above grade level, etc., or exceeding standards. But they're also meant to tell you the kinds of strategies students use or don't use as they read to help you design further instruction. So that's an example of something that could be formative or summative, but I think most people consider them formative assessments, oral reading records. Um, I also want you to understand the difference between formal versus informal assessments. Some of those are pretty obvious. So, for example, formal assessments are things like standardized tests or other, maybe a midterm exam, something like that that you might take in college. In a elementary classroom, again, ISATs, standardized tests, MAP testing, things like that would be considered formal assessments. Um, Other things that are somewhat formal but not really formal would be things like qualitative reading inventories. And these are assessments where students might read through word lists to see their automaticity or how well they can identify words in isolation. They also assessing a student's oral reading and then perhaps responding to some comprehension questions that could be considered a bit more of a formal assessment. But those kinds of assessments aren't super formal in the sense that they're not fill in the bubble, you have to be silent, that kind of assessment. I have both formal and informal assessments highlighted, not because we're going to be engaging students in standardized tests and that kind of thing in 209, but because you will be doing some assessments such as recording students' oral reading and things like that, which are a little bit more in that semi-formal range. So I highlighted both. Um, Informal assessments are things that are done a little bit more on the fly, or they're ongoing as you're engaging in instruction. So when you squat down next to a student to have an impromptu reading conference, or a writing conference to talk with them about what they're reading, what strategies they're using, etc. And then you're jotting down some anecdotal notes, or you're keeping an observational record, or checklist. That's informal assessment, and it's ongoing. You're sort of doing that on an iterative basis as you go through the school year. Every time you interact with students and you have this little voice behind your ear saying, is this student getting what I'm trying to say? I'm getting some fuzzy looks from my students, like they have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't think they understand. All of those little voices in your head, where you're asking, are students getting this? Am I being clear? What more do I need to do? That's all assessment as well, and that's very, very informal. So we're going to be engaging mostly in informal assessments with Patricia's students, and a little bit of semi-formal assessments with assessing students' oral reading. For today, or for this week, you read about affective assessments in Chapter 1 of Accessible Assessment. I just want you, I'm not actually going to be spending much time in this presentation or and you won't be spending much time in the other two activities for today talking about these affective assessments. They're pretty straightforward, but I just want you to be familiar with this term, affective assessments, which again refers to how students feel about literacy activities. Another way of saying that is it gets at their emotional stance toward literacy. Included within this category of affective assessments are kinds of surveys and interviews and questions you can ask students to get at their identity, how they understand themselves as readers and writers, and their attitude about literacy. Is it something they enjoy? Are they engaged or disengaged or somewhere in between from literacy activities in school or at home? And then this is related to identity. You can also use some of the instruments in Chapter 1 of the text to get at students' self-perceptions as readers and writers, whether they view themselves as strategic readers or poor readers or what have you. And then also interests, and not just interests in terms of books and what they like to write about or what kinds of texts they enjoy, but their overall interests. And this is where a lot of teachers like to get at students' funds of knowledge, both cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge, as well as pop culture funds of knowledge. What kinds of movies do they like? What kinds of TV shows? What kinds of sports are they interested in? As soon as you learn those things, that's your way into really engaging students in the classroom. I also wanted to talk briefly about global versus local knowledge outcomes. In the reading you did just prior to Thanksgiving, you learned about the affective assessments as well as global versus local knowledge outcomes. In 209 and with Patricia students, we're going to be focusing primarily on global knowledge outcomes. And I'm not going to go over those terms now, but if you can't remember what I'm talking about, then I want you to go back to the beginning of that reading from the Thursday before Thanksgiving and review, because that's pretty important. Local knowledge outcomes, we will be focusing a little bit on that, but not to the same extent as global. And this whole framework of really emphasizing the global over the local is not because the local isn't important, but because those finer skills such as spelling and grammar and stuff like that really only are meaningful in the context of making meaning with and about text. So we really are focusing on literacy as meaning-making processes. So again, we don't ignore local knowledge outcomes, but we tend to focus more on global knowledge outcomes. Trust. Trust is in big, bold, red letters there because I actually think it's something that the authors of Accessible Assessment don't talk about enough. we've talked about trust and sort of, as Patricia says, getting naked with your students and really getting to know them as people. That's absolutely essential. That's how you build a trusting relationship. And once you build a trusting relationship with your students, you then have opened up so many more pathways to teaching and learning. And so when we meet with Patricia's students during final exam time, at the end of the semester, one of the things I'm going to be looking for is that you really start to get to know students. And I'm going to invite you to to select some of the affective assessments in this book to do that. And also maybe even consider filling out some of those interest inventories yourself, or asking your student to interview you, or perhaps share some information about yourself and your own interests, rather than just grilling students or asking them about their interests. So anyway, that's just that whole framework of trust is one that I really view as a biggie. And if you accomplish absolutely nothing else on a final exam day when we meet with Patricia's students, I want you to try and establish a trusting relationship with your students. All right, so with that in mind, let's go on to just the next slide. And this is just meant to, oh, let's see, how can I do this? This is just meant to introduce to you, why can't I get there? There we go. The assessment instructions cycle. And this can be viewed as a framework for how we're going to be going about our work starting on final exam day and then through the end of 209 in the spring semester. So you will see that students are at the center of the assessment instruction cycle. And so you really begin there, and you begin by trying to assess who your student is as a person. Again, using those interest inventories and things like that can be really helpful in that regard. And you analyze any information you can about who your student is. How does she view herself as a reader, as a writer? What sorts of literacy engagements does she prefer or respond to the most? What kinds of strategies does she use? And and you'll then begin to do maybe some at the beginning of 209, you're going to be assessing your students' oral reading and his or her writing, and you're going to begin analyzing that data and hypothesizing. You're going to begin to make hypotheses about what your students' strengths and needs are. Based on those hypotheses, you're then going to then start planning instruction accordingly and teaching. And then after you teach, you're going to be engaging in some ongoing assessment, ongoing informal assessment. And so you're going to continue to assess, and you're going to continue to analyze as you go how your student is responding to your instruction. How is she developing in response to your instruction? And then based on those ongoing assessments, you're going to draw more hypotheses. And you may find the more and more you learn about your student that you need to adjust some of your assessments or how you understand what your student's strengths and needs are. And as your student develops, you're going to have to then adjust your teaching accordingly and continue pushing that student forward. So you can see that there's this cycle here of assessment and instruction. And this really encompasses all of our work with Patricia students from now until the end of the spring semester. So yeah, so I guess what I should just say is from now through the end of 209, I'm going to be talking about this assessment instruction cycle. You may, as you're engaging in this, this is new to you, and you may find yourself a little bit lost and not sure where you even are in this process, or what to make of some of the assessment data, or how to go about addressing the student's needs and building on his or her strengths. And so, coming back to this visual here can help orient you. Okay, this is what I know about the student. This is what I think he might benefit from. So I'm going to try this and continue moving through this cycle. You'll have some starts and stops along the way where you have to be like, oh, that didn't work. I'm going to go back and try it differently. So this cycle is not just understanding your student, but also understanding you as a teacher and your own learning as a new teacher. So you're going to be assessing yourself and analyzing your notes and your reflections on your teaching to adjust your teaching as you go so that you will get better at this whole process. Um, so, so that's that, the assessment and instruction cycle. All right, before you go on to the next activities for this week, I want to throw out there for next week, we're going to be focusing on assessing students' oral reading. You will have some homework along with some reading where you're going to have to listen to an audio recording of a child reading out loud. I will be sending out an announcement on ReggieNet when I have the audio for that ready for you to engage with, and I'll give you more instructions about that when the time comes. One huge tip, and that is to review the 4 cueing systems. That's going to be the 4 cueing systems are going to be used in a very integral way as you learn how to understand students' oral reading and strategic reading. So I think the best thing you can do for yourself to prepare for this is going to be to review the 4 cueing systems. I would also invite you to chit chat with your 205 CT about how students' oral reading is assessed in your school and in your district. Chances are that your schools will either be using running records, and we'll be learning about that, perhaps miscue analysis, but maybe not so much, typically running records. And then they may also have to engage in some comprehension, like comprehension questions or retells. So we'll be learning about all of that. And so anyway, that's all for now. Ta-ta.